Harmeet Dhillon, you've advocated for parental rights for so long.
Our American educational system inculcated liberal values as the only good values.
China, Qatar, these adversaries are running our colleges.
The adversaries are running our colleges. They're even running secret police forces in the case of China.
It is hard for me to think about the 2026 elections and not continue to worry about election integrity.
The Attorney General is entitled to inspect these voting records. Republican and Democrat secretaries of state are refusing to give it to us. Charlie's killer is going to be brought to justice swiftly. Lives are won and lost and changed by speech. And so I think we need to honor our friend Charlie's life maintaining that mission.
The amazing Harmeet Dhillon. I know you probably chuckle every time I put an extra A in front of your title, but many of us have followed you for a long time. Many of us are parents, and you've advocated for parental rights for so long. And I'm not sure how many people got to know you very well. And so I actually, before we get into policy and all the things that you've been doing now that you're in government, I just want to hear the story of you.
Sure. Well, I was born in India to a family of military leaders in India. And my dad was a doctor. And when he was getting educated and married my mom, they jointly decided they'd like to have a better future for their family than what was available in India in the 1960s, which was a third world country and also sort of a Soviet client state at the time, and planned economy and a lot of things that they didn't like. And so my dad, like many people in his medical school, actually, perhaps the majority of them, sought to complete his training in the West and settled in the West. And so we lived in England for a couple of years while he was doing medical residency there. My brother was born there. And then we came to the United States in the early 70s, where my dad was a chief resident at Yeshiva University, Albert Einstein Medical School in orthopedics. That was his passion. And then, from those years of living in the Bronx, my parents decided they did not want to raise their children in a city, but rather in a more rural environment, more sort of aligned with their values. And so my dad ended up moving us to rural North Carolina, where one of his other classmates happened to be practicing medicine in a small town there. So for a couple of decades, my dad was the only orthopedic surgeon in a rural farming community in North Carolina. That's where I grew up, went to school. I started in New York in kindergarten and first grade in the Bronx, public school 108. And then I completed my education in North Carolina in public schools, including the North Carolina School of Science and Mathematics. I skipped a grade, I skipped the 8th grade, and I was 16 when I graduated from high school. And I personally was ready for a break from rural North Carolina at that time. And so I selected the college that was the farthest away from North Carolina to attend college at Dartmouth College in New England. So I was a 16-year-old who showed up there and, by happenstance, connected with some great conservative leaders there, and that really shaped the rest of my career.
I was going to ask you, how did you form your conservative opinions? Because generally, like the Jewish community, many people who come from India seem to be brainwashed by the Ivy League schools, and they end up going and taking a left turn. But you seem to have conservative values.
Well, I learned those conservative values way before I came to college. And if I hadn't learned them at home, I probably would have turned out like every other, well-educated egghead from the Ivy League schools. But my parents are very conservative socially and economically. And when they became citizens, and my brother and I were sworn in as citizens as children with my mom, when she got her naturalization, my dad got it first. As soon as they could, they became citizens. Adults have to take citizenship tests. And so actually a lot of immigrants are actually much more educated about what America means than native-born people. And my mom because she was working in my dad's office, but she had more time on her hands than Dad did as an on-call doctor. She became a volunteer Republican election monitor in our rural county. And in the 1970s and 1980s in North Carolina, segregation was fairly recent, and you did still see the signs of that. So in the South, what that meant is the Dixiecrats were still kind of in power. Democrats were running North Carolina. And it was the Republicans who were in favor of integration and of equal rights for all people. And people forget that part of our history. So it was my mom preventing a landowner from going into the voting booth to vote for their sharecropper or their employee, and telling them they had to maintain the distance and let the voter vote, and the election workers are there to provide support. So those were some of the stories I heard. They also learned as recent immigrants that you cannot just simply keep to yourself and do your thing. My parents are very religious. They started, and today still, my mom still continues to be an elder in our Sikh temple in Durham, North Carolina. But they started worshiping together. But they also understood the importance from other immigrant communities who they saw. They saw the Jewish community, the Orthodox Jewish community in New York, how active they were in politics. And my dad said it's important for us to be active in politics. So we had a number of fundraisers at our home over the years. We had Senator Jesse Helms in our home many times, and Republicans running for Congress. The parents were donors to the first gubernatorial candidate to win as a Republican in decades in North Carolina. And so that was something that I experienced. I thought everyone did that, in their house. And then they had all the other Indian community leaders, doctors, and others come over to their house for these fundraisers. And so the North Carolina Republicans also began to recognize that the Indian American community was important, not only as a voting bloc, but as a donor bloc. And that was important when, you wanted to have the ear of somebody in power over an issue. But as a small business person, and today medicine is so different. I ran into Marty McCary outside the White House recently. We were talking about this, how different it is today. But in the 80s and 90s, well-educated doctors would start their own business and they would have their own practice. And so my dad did that. He was a small business person. And it was literally when I got in trouble in second grade for having an argument with a classmate over the Ford Carter election. And, I had heard at the dinner table that high taxes were bad, and, Dad was paying them, and, all about tax shelters and marginal capital gains tax rate. I heard that at home as a child. And so it's just something that was inculcated in me from a young age, and also inculcated in me that you have a great opportunity. In India and in most of the world, your circumstances can be dictated by your last name and where you were born. We don't believe in the caste system in Sikhism, but most Indians are kind of stratified by how they were born and who was their dad. Not so in America. My dad taught me anybody can be anything here. You just have to work hard and work harder than the next person. And that is how you can get ahead. So that's kind of what I went to college with. That was already what I was armed with. There was no internet back then. My parents had the values of 1 hour of television if you're good, do your chores. They were well off enough, but my brother and I mowed the lawn, did the laundry, loaded the dishes, cleaned our own rooms. And, those were just the values of our immigrant family.
So many Jewish families live a conservative value, but they don't vote for conservatives. And people ask me this question all the time. Marissa, you're Jewish. Why are Jews not voting conservative? Why are they still with the left? And things are changing a little bit now since October 7th. But I'd love to ask you the same question. Why are so many children of immigrants from India on the left, given what you just described? You live a conservative value. Every person from India that I know lives a conservative life at home, and for some bizarre reason, votes for the left.
Well, I would put it as very good marketing by Democrats and very bad marketing by Republicans. The Democratic Party has done a much better job of outreach to immigrants. Outreach to them as a voting bloc, I think a relatively poor job until recently of actually promoting people of different backgrounds for office. When I ran for the state assembly in California in 2008, I was literally the first Indian American to ever be a major party nominee for state assembly in California. Today, there are many members in Congress, and Democrats and Republicans alike have run and successfully, but it is actually a fairly recent phenomenon. And I think that's what it is. I mean, I was together for 16 years and married to a man who was very conservative, but he was a Democrat when he became a citizen, because that's what he learned, is that the Democrat Party is where you're welcome, and the Republican Party is all white people. And They don't share, they won't welcome you. So there's that indoctrination. And I have to say, the Republican Party actually is very welcoming, but we don't market on that kind of racial basis. And the Democrats do, and that's actually quite effective. That's why Coke and, Benetton and companies do that. It's actually effective to communicate to people with identity politics. I don't think there's anything wrong with that as long as you aren't sort of running your government that way. But attracting people like to be with other people they like. And so, I got really frustrated in the Republican National Committee on these issues because we just did a really poor job of that. It was sort of taco diplomacy. There's an election coming up, and let's put out a piñata and eat some tacos and try to recruit Hispanics. That's not authentic.
Yeah.
And so, I just think that's a big gap. And we have sort of started to understand this. We have more and more. We have Vivek Ramaswamy. We have the second lady. We've had Bobby Jindal and Nikki Haley. But it's complicated. We're starting a race from decades behind.
Yeah.
So I think that is the reason. And then the other factor that is important and kind of relevant to what Prager does is our American educational system for the last several decades, but certainly since after I went to school, but in more recent years.
Pretty much since Carter, actually, since you mentioned him.
So yeah, since I've been in these schools, has inculcated liberal values as the only good values. And so every Indian person is educated, right?
Yes.
I don't know anyone who's telling their kids it's okay to be a dropout and what have you.
Just like the
not
Jewish
acceptable,
community.
Not acceptable. So what are they exposed to? They're exposed to these far left ideas. And unless they're being actively deprogrammed by their parents or pre-programmed by their parents, that's how they end up. Your average Indian American parent household is 2 doctors or 1 doctor and an engineer or an entrepreneur. And they're not homeschooling and they're not inculcating the values in that way. So they're leaving it, they're outsourcing it to the educational industrial complex.
Yes.
Where they came from, there was no indoctrination in the schools. Like you learned your calculus and your English and your history. And so it's kind of a hidden threat and people don't realize it until it's too late. So I think that's one of the problems. And it happens to every family. And it's very few families that have that level of intense moral training. I happen to have that in my family that inoculates you from that.
You had a very personal experience with crime, and I'd love for you to share a little bit about it because I've been thinking a lot about it recently. Your husband was shot, right?
I had a husband who was shot in the chest in New York in 1994. I had just been married a few months. He was doing his medical residency in NYU, and I was going home. I was at home cooking dinner after my long hours at a New York law firm, and I got a call from the chaplain at NYU saying, your husband has been shot and you should get down here quickly. He may not survive. So I jumped into a cab. I went down the FDR, got to the hospital, and he was there. He was alive. He was awake. And there was a bullet wound with blood pumping out of his chest. And it was a surreal situation. He had been shot on a bus going home, and a security guard who had been intoxicated got on the bus with an open bottle of alcohol. And the bus driver, the bus was getting crowded. It was rush hour. The bus driver eventually pulled over while this altercation was happening and let everybody out except for the assailant and my husband at the time. And it was a racial incident. The person was calling him names based on his identity. Mistook him for a Hindu, calling him a Hindu, MFer, and telling him to kneel. And my husband was 6 foot plus, wasn't going to kneel to this crazy person. And a shooting ensued. With the grace of God, only 1 bullet went through him. The other one was blocked by a stethoscope. And he staggered out onto the street, and one of his medical residents happened to be walking by and flagged down a cop car, and that's how he got to the hospital.
Wow.
But for the, that sequence of events and being a doctor and knowing that he had to get to the hospital quickly and being awake. Anyway, this person shot himself in the testicles after he shot my husband. And so he ended up in NYU as well in the same emergency room. It was a crazy story.
Wow.
But I didn't ride public transport after that. It was kind of a defining moment for me. And so what I was left with in the criminal justice system is this person who took out a gun and shot my husband twice got a 2-year sentence. And that was criminal justice in New York in 1994, 95. So, you don't see it much different today. People are getting off very lightly, committing heinous crimes, and it's become a culture of crime in our cities. So,
You're obviously a very capable person. You're very smart. Almost every conservative lawyer I know works for a giant, wealthy, big firm. You took a different route. You went into civil rights, which must have been somewhat unique when you first got started.
well, I started out the same way because I give this speech to young lawyers at Federalist Society events and tell them that when I got out of law school in 1993, there was no ADF or any of the other conservative institutions. I mean, I worked at the Heritage Foundation for a year between college and law school. There were very few conservative institutions, certainly none that were legally based that you could make your career at. Now, I did spend one summer during law school at a nonprofit in DC called the Center for Individual Rights, which did some important work challenging racial quotas at America's institutions of higher learning. So they did a lot of important work there, but they were so small. There were like 3 lawyers. You wouldn't have been able to make your career doing that as an entry-level lawyer. So I went and got my training, and I was married again to this doctor, and I was the breadwinner of the family while he was doing his medical residency. So I worked in big law. I worked in New York and London and Silicon Valley and San Francisco for a decade, and I learned my trade. I also did a lot of pro bono work because A, that was the only way to get actual courtroom time in a big faceless institution, and B, it was the only work I was doing that I actually felt good about morally at the end of the day, helping victims of domestic violence, helping refugees fleeing certain death because of their religious beliefs from countries including India, Kashmir, Tibet, Eritrea, and other countries where being a Christian or being a Buddhist or being Muslim could be a very negative place to be in these countries. And so, and other work like that. But that was the only work I was like, okay, 2 billionaires are fighting over an M&A transaction. That's socially useful and certainly pays well, but not particularly inspiring. And so I spent my time doing that, and it became increasingly less satisfying to me morally. Very long hours, very good pay, and really often I felt like I was on the wrong side of issues. I was representing the sexual harassers and the polluters and the discriminators and the people who were, the establishment, and I'm kind of an anti-establishment person. And so I started my own law firm. It's almost 20 years ago now, and it was hard. I had no clients. I had no, I took a risk. I took a major risk with my career, but I felt like I needed to do that. It was a seminal decision in my life to do that. And then later I got famous doing some prominent cases, and then I was approached by people who said they wanted to support my work. So then I had to start a nonprofit to do that. And today I've provided jobs for probably 50 people through the legal work that I started as a solo practitioner 20 years ago.
I want to spend a minute just chronicling some of the amazing work that you had done in the nonprofit space. What are some cases that you took on in the nonprofit that you feel have changed you and maybe shaped who you are?
Well, the nonprofit is only about 5 years old, 6 years old. We started it right before COVID. And how I started it was also happenstance. Out of the blue in 2017, I got a call from a Republican lawyer who told me that the University of California was not letting conservative speakers speak on the campus. And Young America's Foundation was looking for a lawyer to immediately go and handle that. It was a Thursday. And I got a letter out to Berkeley by Thursday afternoon. They responded the next day. I got a second letter out to them, and we sued them on Monday. And that's the pace in private practice. The pace in the government, that's like a 4-month time lapse to do that. But when you're in private practice, you can do that quickly. And that's how I met Mark Trammell, who became my first general counsel of my nonprofit. He was in-house at Young America's Foundation. We filed that case and we won, and that brought more fame and attention and so forth. But the nonprofit started to mainly focus on speech issues. We had no idea COVID was going to come and upend our way of life in ways that we're still suffering from in this country today. In fact, I was lamenting to somebody in the DOJ that the whole class of lawyers who graduated law school in the last 5 years, a lot of them spent time in remote learning, and they didn't learn much, unfortunately. And then they got jobs that were remote, and they set their careers back even further by taking that route. So anyway, I digress. But the first case that we took on was the case of Andy Ngo, the journalist in Portland, Oregon, who is a monomaniac at the time about Antifa and still is very focused on that issue. And he was exposing the Antifa violence happening in that city. And it was really my first encounter with transgender people being violent as well. Andy was attacked on 2 different instances by gangs of these Antifa thugs for doing journalism.
Yeah.
They recognized him. They violently attacked him. It's on film. And I got to know Andy before both of these assaults. He just kind of was a young person, and he wanted to meet me. He came to San Jose, I think, to meet a family member. So I met him after a court hearing, and we started staying in touch. And when I saw him assaulted, I reached out to him, and I offered to help him. And he said, well, what can you do? I mean, these are criminals. I said, well, we can try to hold them accountable. We have federal laws. You cannot beat people like that. So we're going to go after them and sue them for attacking you. It was a very novel thing for a conservative institution to do. First of all, no normal lawyer in their right mind would do that case because there's no money at the end of it, because these thugs, these criminals, don't have money. They're shiftless lowlifes. How are you even going to find them? They're wearing masks, and they're, cloaked in paramilitary attire, and they're successful at evading people. But we wanted to send the message that it wasn't going to be free to just attack journalists in the United States. And so poor Andy was, beaten twice and suffered significantly from that. He doesn't even, live in his city of Portland anymore because of that. His mother was threatened. A bunch of goons came to his house in masks.
I don't think he lives in America anymore.
He doesn't live, I mean, he's abroad for that reason. I think he had a very bad experience here, but he continues to chronicle Antifa's violence. So anyway, after many years, our nonprofit did succeed in winning a settlement from one of these horrible people who continues to assault people and be violent in Portland, by the way. The local authorities have done nothing about that. And we won default judgments against several of them. But what was interesting in that process is you'd think these shiftless losers would have no access to justice themselves. Not so. Each of them showed up in court after I sued them with their own lawyers paid for by Soros-funded, Tides Foundation-funded nonprofits.
Unbelievable.
This Justice Center and that Justice Center and Immigrants' Rights Project and so forth. And so there's a whole edifice of nonprofits on the left that pays for these violent thugs to do what they do with impunity, or jump the border with impunity, or mutilate children with impunity. And their big law firm is doing that as well. I mean, that's what we learned when we got into the trans space. But among the other cases that we did at the nonprofit included, all these COVID cases. So 2020 rolled around. We're just a few months old. I wasn't even taking a salary at the nonprofit. I was actually, even Mark was bare bones. We had one employee. With one employee, we became the most active nonprofit in the United States, suing governors for violating our civil rights during COVID. And a lot of nonprofits get the credit for that. A lot of them joined the bandwagon after we showed them the roadmap, and we welcomed them because the more the merrier. There was so much work to go around. But a lot of the traditional Christian nonprofits that occupy a lot of the space were afraid to do this work at the beginning. You can go look at the court records and who sued. Very few people sued. And there were very few people as plaintiffs willing to stand up. It was evangelical Christians who were the only ones willing to stand up. And from a litigation perspective as a lawyer, I try to design cases that are not just good cases, but they're also media friendly. and they're appealing from different perspectives because that's how you persuade people. Litigation is a tool for persuasion. And in addition to obviously being an end in and of itself. So I was hoping to find Orthodox Jewish plaintiffs and Catholic plaintiffs and Sikh plaintiffs and Hindu plaintiffs and Muslim plaintiffs. It was only the evangelical Christians who were willing to stand up for their faith. Everyone else wanted to lay low. They didn't want to be blamed in case COVID was actually the threat the government was telling us, and people died. So they didn't want to be blamed.
Yeah.
And in my faith, you're supposed to worship together. You're not supposed to worship by Zoom or apart. It's actually literally part of our faith that you're supposed to come together.
Essential business.
People were willing to phone it in. And I think that's had a negative impact on the importance of congregate worship in the United States. But anyway, we did win those cases at the Supreme Court. We won 3 cases at the Supreme Court against Gavin Newsom. We lost cases involving so many other issues. But that's what impact litigation is about. You have to be willing to lose, because those first cases that change the law, they always lose. The Brown versus Board of Education was at the end point of many cases that lost, that tried to stand up for the rights of African Americans to have equal rights in our country. And most of those cases lost.
Yeah.
Dred Scott. Most of these cases lost. We had Korematsu case where our government said it was okay to put Japanese origin second and third generation citizens into internment camps. So you have to be willing to stand up as a lawyer to challenge laws and rulings that you think are wrong. You're going to lose quite a bit until you win. So that's a mentality that is not a conservative mentality. And so a lot of conservative lawyers are conservative in the bad way. Oh, we can't sue there. We can't sue in the Ninth Circuit. There's no good precedent there. Well, guess what, guys? There's never going to be any good precedent there or any good judges if you don't challenge the dominant orthodoxy. So that has always been my mentality, is to go into the belly of the beast where the needs are the greatest and make those challenges there.
Well, I think the other value that you brought to all of us was your discernment and your understanding of the court of public opinion. So you talk about Andy Ngo, and I don't know if you know this, Harmeet, but the case that you represented Andy Ngo on had such an impact, not just within the United States, but globally. So Winston Marshall, who's a good friend of ours, he is the banjoist with Mumford and Sons. Mm-hmm. He was so impacted by the book that Andy Ngo wrote that he tweeted about it. And once he tweeted about it, of course, the speech patrollers on social media went after him. He ended up leaving the band. Yeah. And now he is an advocate for free speech, and he's an advocate for America. And so you never know where you plant those seeds. But certainly this lawfare that the left uses against us is not something that we should ignore. And we cannot ignore the impact of the court of public opinion, which has been really many of the cases that you've taken. You mentioned that forever you've been on the side of anti-government.
That's right.
Which is funny, because the first thing I saw when I saw you was that I giggled. And it's interesting because you and I are anti-establishment people. We're always fighting the government. We're always trying to shrink the government. But here you are now in the government. And so I'm just curious, when did it click for you that you're actually in the government? You're on the other side of this.
Well, I will tell you that early in my career, I had a desire to become an assistant United States attorney. But again, I was the breadwinner of my family at the time, supporting my medical resident husband, and it just didn't really work out for us. And so it's a regret that I have that I didn't get to do that. I would have enjoyed being able to do that, but it didn't happen. So I threw myself into my career as it was. And the ability the beauty of the government is really, but it's a potential. Most people face this potential. And I mean, it depends on who you are when you go in, right? So I will tell you that quite a few people in the federal government at the political appointee level, in their 30s and 40s, are really doing it not for that job, but what's the next job, or what's the next thing I can get out of it? Or even worse, how can I trade on this fairly soon? Okay, that's just a fact of life. It's not a Democrat or Republican thing. It's just a thing. It's absolutely a thing. And lawyers are the worst at this, because they're like, how can I take a job now that'll get me clients afterwards? Like, that is not my mentality at all. Obviously, I had plenty of clients. The clients included the president and numerous media figures. And, at my level and at the level of some very successful people in the government, they're not there for that. They're there to give back. And so that's a difference. I've given up a lot to do this, so I try to make every single day count. There are no days where I'm just phoning it in. Every day has to count for every day that I'm here and the president wants me here. And so there is a lot of power in the government. I have spent most of my career suing the government. But under our federal civil rights laws, I've been suing state governments. I've rarely sued the federal government. I'm sure I have at some point, but so I'm still doing that now. The Civil Rights Division is unique in that, unlike most of the cases you read about in the press that the DOJ is involved in, or my good friend John Sauer, who's the Solicitor General, he's doing the brainy stuff at the Supreme Court and defending the executive orders and injunctions and all of that. We have the Civil Division defending the government against routine lawsuits all over the country. We filed the same kinds of lawsuits that I filed in private practice and in my nonprofit. You can file those from the Civil Rights Division. Nobody ever did it before. Your average conservative lawyer who sat in the seat that I've had in the Civil Rights Division that I have is a big law lawyer, mid-career, came from a big law firm where they did defense work exclusively. They wouldn't know how to draft a complaint, if their life depended on it. They know how to delay things, drag them out, issue interrogatories and discovery, and win a motion on summary judgment. Very little trial experience, et cetera. And so that's what people are used to. And even the career lawyers in the DOJ Civil Rights Division, they're almost all very liberal in their perspective. And that's not a criticism, it's just a fact. They are idealistic, and they wish to see the government used to do idealistic things, in their view, prevent discrimination. These are, and I agree with a lot of these goals, whatever. But if they don't have that private practice background, and most of these liberal civil rights lawyers don't, you're doing 1/10 of the work that we do in private practice. Like, I only get paid in private practice if I bill hours and my client pays me, or I win a case in court and the government pays me. That's how I win. You can just phone it in and work 9 to 5. During COVID, particularly, the work schedules of these government lawyers, which I'm still living with some of them because they have contracts or, work agreements.
I thought they all resigned once you were there.
There's still quite a few. And I don't, if they're willing to do the job, that's fine. But if they want to work 4 days a week and have 3 days off, that doesn't really work for me. If they want to have remote work as their sort of permanent work arrangement, that doesn't really work, And so it's really frustrating for someone who's used to a sort of private practice work ethic. So I've tried to marry my idealism of my activism with the private practice work ethic. And that is revolutionary in the Department of Justice. People have quit because we're making them work too hard. I put out a call for victims of anti-American bias in the labor market, i.e. preference of foreign workers with visas over American workers. We got over 100 complaints over a weekend. And then lawyers who had been willing to do that job, they quit because they were like, this is too much work. But that's the work we signed up to do. And they signed up for that job. They just didn't want to do that much of it.
Yeah.
So that's not how it works. The president sets a very strong work ethic agenda. So does my boss, Pam Bondi. And that's the pace we're setting in the DOJ.
What is it like working with Pam Bondi? You hear the left say all kinds of things about her.
Pam is first of all, incredibly kind and wonderful lady. And she's very smart and accomplished. You don't become the attorney general for nothing, or the state attorney general. And so she really knows her stuff, and she cares deeply about people. And her passions include human trafficking and animal welfare. And so I spent, quite a bit of my time recently with her on a couple of important issues. And she always has very important insights. And so she's very driven. And I think she's doing a great job. But, it's a huge job.
Huge.
The DOJ I'm the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. At my level, there's 7 or 8 different, I'm one of the biggest components of the DOJ, but there's the Civil Division, the Criminal Division, the Environmental and Natural Resources Division. There's tax, there's Office of Legal Policy, Office of Legal Counsel, the Solicitor General's office. There's the Antitrust Division. And so there's so many different sections. So you have to be a good manager to manage all of that. the day-to-day. Todd Blanche, the Deputy Attorney General, really does a lot of that management because our boss is traveling all over the country and, doing a lot of important things. She's in the Oval with the president frequently on policy matters. So Todd runs the day-to-day, interact with him regularly, and with the folks in the associate's office as well. So we have just a great team, and there are a lot of patriots over there in the DOJ.
What do you think are the 3 most important things that you're working on now at the DOJ?
Well, I have 11 sections in the Civil Rights Division, so I don't want anyone to get mad at me back in the office. But I would say the ones that I interact most, I am the point person on negotiating with America's universities over ending DEI and antisemitism. I do have other lawyers working with me, but it's kind of at the level of where the president is personally interested in this, and there's a lot of special interests involved in it as well. So I've had to sort of personally step in. So I've had numerous meetings with university presidents, and in the last few days with, some of the things that have happened in the news, and you see terrible things being said by people in public trust. I send emails to the lawyers for these institutions saying, what is going on? You want me to give a clean bill of health to your university, and yet people are glorifying death and violence. That doesn't seem to be consistent with the pedagogical imperative and all the billions of dollars the United States is giving your institution. So, that kind of pressure does have an impact on these institutions. So that's a top priority right now. We've had a few hate crimes in the United States. So, prosecuting the hate crimes and making examples out of the killers in Colorado who senselessly the killer in Colorado who firebombed those Jewish protesters who were simply not even protesters, they were just doing a vigil to remember the victims of October 7th, and they were mercilessly killed because of that. So that's a very important aspect of what we do. The employment area is an important part. Protecting American workers is a very important part of what we do.
Against DEI?
Against DEI, if they're public employers. Sometimes we handle private employers as well. I deal regularly with the EEOC as well. We try to coordinate all of these things. But the preferences of foreign workers over American workers is affecting a lot of people, particularly in the high-tech sector. And I come from California, so I've seen it in person. I have had calls with the labor secretary's office as well over these issues. So that's an important issue. And, eradicating anti-Semitism in various forms. It and other religious discrimination, not just Jews, but all people of faith are under attack in the United States.
Well, there's discrimination against Asians in colleges because you can't make it into medical school.
So the admissions issue is a college issue that I was mentioning. So Harvard, UNC, these other schools have all been actively discriminating against whites and Asians, and really robbing people of their educational opportunities. And so there are just so many.
It's amazing to me that the Indian community, by the way, doesn't see it. Like it's like the Jewish community. They worship these universities that don't accept them.
It's like a form of personal suicide. And now that people see me doing it, they'll come up to me privately and say, my kid had his 1,400 or 1,600 on the SAT. They couldn't get into medical school in the United States. And I'm like, well, maybe you shouldn't have voted
Democrat. The medical schools are especially discriminatory.
The medical schools are amongst the toughest nuts to crack. And not just medical, but nursing. I've been shocked to see the extent to which the nursing schools are pumping out radical leftists. So the people taking care of your elderly family or your vulnerable family in America's hospitals are like the wokest people in America. It's actually quite scary. That's why you saw them dancing in these dumb TikTok videos. They were like the first line of silly in the COVID mania.
Right. Can you explain gerrymandering? Because I think that is also very significant, and I know that you've gotten involved in it.
So gerrymandering dates back to the early 1800s, and it is a practice whereby the political line drawing, that is a political act, generally speaking, in the states, is so extreme that you see contortions in a voting district that are literally drawn to benefit one party or the other, okay? And now, where does race come into this? Well, race has come into it through, I think, some tortured interpretations and applications of the Federal Voting Rights Act, which has built into it some provisions that called out certain states for being racist in their line drawing legitimately. But we're talking about 60 plus years ago. I mean, America's moved on a lot from the 1950s and 60s. And our laws have failed to keep up with that. So actually, the United States Supreme Court recognized how some of these permanent penalty boxes for certain states were no longer constitutional in a case several years ago, Shelby County case involving an Alabama line drawing. And so you still, however, have a confused jurisprudence of the Voting Rights Act being applied to require minority districts to be drawn. And here's the interesting thing. I mentioned that political gerrymandering or political line drawing is legal, okay? There has been an assumption by courts and by litigants that what that means is when you add race into the factor is you're drawing districts for Democrats when you're drawing racial districts for African Americans.
Including districts that are spaghetti thin.
Correct. And so what will happen in this tortured analysis is someone will look at a state and say, that state has 10% blacks and it has 10 congressional districts, or it has 7 congressional districts. Well, you're required by law, state, to draw one of those districts to favor an African American winning. And the assumption has also been that's going to be a Democrat district. So that's where all the race to the bottom comes in. All the Republicans are like, great, we'll have a district around that one that benefits Republicans. And then there'll be this one that's driven as a snake throughout the whole state to capture all the blacks. And they're going to be relegated to have some Democrat politician representing them. This seems profoundly un-American to me on so many levels. I do agree that there was a time, even when I was living in rural North Carolina, where definitely the line drawing was such that was to try to disenfranchise African Americans. Again, I'm older. That is a long time ago. It is not the case in 2025. The United States Supreme Court has taken up a case called Calais. So Louisiana and Calais are the parties in that case. It was supposed to be heard in the last term, and then there was a stay, and now it's coming back. It's going to be argued before the Supreme Court on October 15th after some additional briefing. So just soon, that case will be argued. And that case may determine whether racial line drawing either is required or is even allowed.
How can it not be racist?
Well, it is racist. It is racist. And the premise, like affirmative action, which was literally okay
Racist.
fairly recently, is we need to draw lines this way because otherwise nobody would ever vote for an African American, which is, of course, ridiculous when you've had an African American president, African American, Jamaican American, Indian American vice president, and Congress is full of people, by the way, of both parties. So the other assumption that you're going to draw a Democrat district for African Americans is no longer the case. You look at Texas. Yeah. Texas has sent many minority Republicans to Texas and Democrats. There does not appear to be a problem there of white people not voting for blacks or vice versa. So there are a lot of flawed assumptions there. And Justice Thomas, in dissenting from the stay in the Calais case, really gave a roadmap to what is wrong and broken with gerrymandering and the Voting Rights Act when he pointed out the ludicrousness of it and how the entire jurisprudence of the Voting Rights Act is inconsistent with equal protection jurisprudence in the United States, which increasingly holds that any type of racial set-asides or racial decision-making by a government is illegitimate unless you can prove a recent history and a direct tie between the temporarily racist act to remedying that recent racist history. And so I am hopeful that the court will, but the court frequently punts on some of these most controversial cases, so we don't know what the court is going to do. But this is an opportunity for the court to say racial gerrymandering is illegal. And then you're going to go back to political gerrymandering, which is what's happening in California right now. Now, while our current jurisprudence is still there, however, if the wacky lines that the California legislature and governor are trying to cram down the throats of California residents turn out to be racist in nature, we'll see what happens.
It is hard for me to think about the 2026 elections and not continue to worry about election integrity. And I'm curious, what can you do on the DOJ front to restore Americans' trust in the election system?
So the first thing I'll say about that is I am a firm believer in the 10th Amendment and the fact that the majority of the laws in the United States are actually meant to be and should be administered by the states. And this specifically includes our election laws. So the time, place, and manner of elections and how they're run, the details of them are left to the states and state legislatures specifically. What we saw in 2020 was an unprecedented violation of that constitutional reservation of the making of the election laws to state legislatures. Judges took it over. Secretaries of states took it over. Plaintiffs' lawyers took it over and dictated vote by mail. Courts and states simply ignored their laws. Like Wisconsin had a very good law limiting absentee ballots to people who were medically unable to vote in person. They were in a nursing home or they had some other disability. Just ignored that. Just make it open for everybody. How are we going to fix that? Well, frankly, it is still for states to fix that. And unfortunately, we voters do not hold our local officials accountable. Now, at the federal level, I'm responsible at the Civil Rights Division for administering numerous federal statutes involving voting. The Help America Vote Act, which requires clean voter rolls. National Voter Registration Act, which provides for motor voter and other sort of technical ways of registering people to vote easily, which we all like. The Voting Rights Act, which governs equal access to the ballot. And then there's UOCAVA, which is a awkward acronym that covers the law that allows military and overseas voters to be able to vote, which is a giant loophole. And the military voters end up being a small percentage of those. Every federal election involves tens of thousands of voters in some states voting from abroad. They claim they are residents of that state. They may have no ties to that state. And what Democrats have been urging people to do over the last few decades is claim residency and vote if you're a foreign resident voter in a battleground state. So they're, doing that. Republicans are not doing that, of course, because that's wrong. They're not doing that. So there's a unilateral disarmament on the UOCAVA front of people just voting where it's convenient for their political party as opposed to where they legitimately have a right to vote. So, there may be some fixes coming to that.
Are you optimistic that the fixes can happen by 2026? It's coming up real soon.
Some fixes will occur. I will tell you the other obstacle I'm facing is one of the things I did at the beginning of my tenure is start writing to all the secretaries of state to provide us their voter lists. Under the Help America Vote Act and under another federal civil rights law, the Attorney General is entitled to inspect these voting records. So we're asking for them. And Republican and Democrat secretaries of state are refusing to give it to us. So we're having to go to court to force them to give us these records. You know what they're saying? They're saying, oh, we don't want to give you the last four of the social of these voters because it's a privacy issue. It's a privacy issue. Who issues the Social Security numbers? The federal government issues the Social Security numbers. So this is a silly argument that some courts have been buying. I literally just won, overturning of an injunction in South Carolina on this issue. So, we're going to court. We're enforcing these rights. But in the Civil Rights Division, historically, Republicans haven't been active at all, and Democrats haven't been active on these issues either. Nobody has been enforcing our clean voting rolls issues. And so it's past time to do that. We will do our best to play catch up here, but we need Republicans and Democrats alike to be cooperating. It's their job. It's their duty to comply. And what we're doing with this data is we're, comparing it to other states. We're comparing it to other databases, and we're helping states with their job of cleaning their voter rolls. They're required to do that.
You would think that they would want that.
I mean, I got into an exchange during my confirmation hearings with Senator Padilla from California. Senator Padilla's job was the Secretary of State of California to clean our voter rolls in California. Guess what? He didn't do that job at all. And so Judicial Watch sued Los Angeles County and won a settlement in 2017 where Los Angeles admitted it had over 1 million people in the county who are not entitled to be on the voter rolls.
Unbelievable.
In one county in the United States. And yet we get gaslit for complaining about this. Oh, voter fraud is very rare. Well, how do you know? I mean, nobody's checking who's on the voter rolls. And so I do think it's a real problem. And even one miscast vote is a violation of the federal civil rights laws because it dilutes the vote of a legitimate voter and it violates the principle of one person, one vote.
Well, in so many counties, it's, 1,000 votes could just make a difference.
A single vote. The whole control of the Virginia legislature a few years ago came down to a single vote.
Yeah. Harmeet, I kept this question for the end of our conversation because it's a hard one, and it is about what is happening on college campuses. And all of us have been working on college campuses, but if there was anybody who worked the hardest, I would say it was Charlie Kirk. He died for speech. He was shot in his neck while speaking. They shut him up. It was an incredibly emotional time and moment when I learned that my dear friend Charlie Kirk was murdered for work that he and you and I have been so passionate about. And I'm sure that you share the same sentiment about what is happening on our campuses in America.
Yeah, well, first let me say, I learned about Charlie's shooting because I had hired a young Turning Point activist to be a special project manager in my office. And I knew that she had the ability to help me with getting the word out about our work and helping us with hiring and so many different things that Turning Point is actually good at. She learned it for 5 years working at Turning Point. She ran into my office sobbing. And I was having a meeting and she interrupted the meeting because she knew that I would care about this. And she's, Charlie's been shot. I don't know what's going to happen. So we all stopped our day and started turning on the television and looking at what was happening. And, it was really just heartbreaking to our DOJ family, actually, because many of us, I knew Charlie personally. I'd been a guest on his show many times. When I ran for chair of the Republican National Committee and challenged the dominant orthodoxy in the RNC, it was politically unpopular to do that. And he stood by me because it was the right thing to do. It was the right thing for young people. It was the right thing for the party to not have that kind of a situation where the same old happened. We didn't bother with our election laws and so forth. And so I consider Charlie a personal friend. He was sitting in my office just a few weeks before he was murdered. And my life has flashed before my eyes since then because I was literally a campus activist at Dartmouth fighting for the exact same things. I sued Dartmouth when I was the editor-in-chief of the Dartmouth Review because Dartmouth wouldn't let our speakers speak, our journalists write. They suspended journalists at my institution, at my newspaper, for their speech. When I introduced William F. Buckley Jr. to speak on the Dartmouth campus, I was almost shouted down by 1,000 students who came to hear him, but they didn't want to hear me say how hard it had been to reserve a room for William F. Buckley Jr. to speak on the Dartmouth campus. I met with the Dartmouth president in my office in April, and I think she's doing a pretty good job. But I reminded her that my friend Andy Ngo had been shouted down on the Dartmouth campus 2 years ago, and maybe President Belloc, maybe you should invite Andy to come back and finish his speech because it's kind of shameful that you guys didn't let him speak. She wasn't the president then, but that needs to be fixed. So all over America, my nonprofit was founded on the grounds of, people not being allowed to speak. Ann Coulter, David Horowitz, the late, great David Horowitz, and, other people who you may disagree with. I disagree with some of these speakers. I certainly do. Ben Shapiro, I forced UC Berkeley to provide security for Ben Shapiro in the middle of that lawsuit. He wouldn't have been able to speak and be heard on the UC Berkeley campus without a lawyer going to court to stand up for those rights. And so people are now being killed, not people, but the most prominent advocate of that speech. And also shocking is the number of fools in this country who think it is acceptable to celebrate that death. I don't know what has happened to this country. I do not think I would have seen that when I was a young person, no matter what. There was a basic level of decency where you saw this was a political assassination. And in prior political assassinations in our country, people have generally come together and said, well, that's wrong, not American. But you're seeing a culture of celebration of death and nihilism. It is really extremely disturbing. But here's the ray of hope. What you're also seeing is hundreds or thousands of people swiftly losing their jobs. I think there is an end to the tolerance for this, actually. So we are calling it out in real time in social media. We will have failed Charlie and all that he lived and died for if we do not carry on that message, that action, that message put into action, and that ultimately training of young people that they should not be afraid of alternate viewpoints. They should not be afraid of debate. They should not be afraid of opening their minds and shaking hands with people with different viewpoints. I think Charlie saved a lot of lives when he opened people's minds about transgender issues and issues like that. I feel like I've saved lives by taking on the transgender establishment and showing people it's okay to challenge it and walk away from it. So these are not just ideas. This is not just a college jam session that we're talking about. Lives are won and lost and changed by speech and by engagement. And so I think we need to honor our friend Charlie's life by maintaining that mission.
What do you think the DOJ can do to make campuses a safer place for our kids?
Well, we're doing it. So first of all, even before this horrific assassination of our friend, we have been insisting on college campuses protecting academic freedom and speech of all students. So students, just for being Jewish, have been prevented from getting an education in some of the top institutions in the world. That's not okay. When we're doing a deal with these institutions to, reach an agreement with them, releasing them from liability, they're agreeing to certain terms. And we're making it safe for all students to be able to get their education there. We're also taking away some of the power in some cases of, some schools are doing it affirmatively, of letting the faculty override student discipline for favored viewpoints. So these are things that we're demanding in our
many
settlements.
of these faculty members are funded by our adversaries, China, Qatar. I mean, these adversaries are running our colleges.
The adversaries are running our colleges. They're even running secret police forces in the case of China on some of these campuses. You go to the Stanford. I went to a meeting at Stanford a few years ago, and I was shocked. I was waiting in the library for my meeting. 2/3 of the people in the library were Chinese American, wealthy
Yes.
Chinese American. I shouldn't say American, Chinese, wealthy Chinese, speaking
Chinese nationals.
Chinese nationals, and we are educating the people planning the destruction of the United States every day with our tax dollars. Even if it's a private Stanford, your and my tax dollars are going to support research there and support all kinds of programs over there. And so we're doing something about it. So first of all, Charlie's killer is going to be brought to justice swiftly. I'm confident of that. There may have been multiple people involved in that incident. They will all be hunted down. We will have a zero tolerance policy for this kind of violence in America. At any level. This DOJ is incredibly, and this FBI is incredibly committed to eradicating that. But ultimately, we have to all be committed. And when I'm going after some of these institutions, they say, academic freedom. We have to have academic freedom. Well, first of all, you don't have to have academic freedom with my tax dollars. You could raise the money for your hateful speech yourself. And we have to be very firm about that. And we also cannot be manipulated by, if you cut off the money from Harvard, how are we going to cure cancer? Maybe you can cure cancer down the road at some school that isn't discriminating against people because of how they were born and what their last name is or their yarmulke or their faith. So we have to be very vigilant. And I think there is this concept that podcasters have talked about of suicidal empathy. And we cannot have this suicidal empathy that cons us because of our better natures into suspending our good judgment and not holding people accountable for their hatred and their violence. Who wants a nurse celebrating somebody's death? That should really be automatic grounds for dismissal.
Yes.
You don't have a speech right, certainly not in the workplace, to celebrate death. That is really strange, and there are very few jobs in which that would be acceptable, in my opinion, and certainly nothing touching healthcare, educating children, or anything like that. And so I just think we have to have stronger resolve. That doesn't mean you shouldn't be kind and empathetic, but it means you should be smart about it, and we should not be designing a society that is a machine to kill us in the end.
PragerU is known as the modern clay pots. And I tell the story that the Hebrews realized that they had the Torah, the Word of God, and they realized that they had to write it down because they were dispersed all over the world as They were indigenous in the land of Israel, and they were kicked out of there. And so they wrote everything down and they hid them in little clay pots. And Dennis had this vision that PragerU would be the clay pots for America and Western civilization, as we take the most important ideas and we capture them, and hopefully in 250 years from now, somebody will be watching this conversation and they will hear about you and the work that you've done. And as we sit here in Washington, D.C., I also think about our founders and when they signed the Declaration of Independence, how worried they were. They were probably very, very scared. They knew what signing that declaration would mean, probably a death sentence. But they did it, and they had courage, like people like you, like Charlie. Charlie enlisted to save America, and by that, I actually think he did. I think he did save us. I think you are saving us. And so there'll be people who are watching this in 250 years from now, just like we're learning about our founders from 250 years ago. I'd love for them to hear from you a message. If you could just put a message into our little time capsule for 250 years from now, what should our great, great, great grandkids know?
Well, what I would say is that the founders of this country were really geniuses, and it's almost like they were superhuman in a way. I mean, I believe, and I've talked about, particularly in the trans context, this concept of natural law and natural rights. And there are rights that come from God that supersede any law of man, but somehow the founders managed to incorporate that concept into documents that lay out the charter of this country. So both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution have very lofty promises in them. And yet, at the beginning of this country and for many decades, there were some people who were not considered to be fully human, and women didn't have the right to vote.
Yeah.
And disabled people weren't able to move around in society. And so what I would say is that we have an opportunity in this generation and in this Department of Justice to actually finally bring to fruition the promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and equal justice for all. That our wise founders started these concepts imperfectly, and then our federal civil rights laws are really landmark in human history in enshrining these concepts of equality and equal protection. And yet, as I came into this office, we still had law enforcement that favored a few Americans over many Americans. And we can stop that with eradicating DEI, with having a colorblind employment and educational system and voting system in our country, and just taking people as they are and eliminating race, color, national origin, and assumptions from that. We have the opportunity to really be that dream ideal society. And you look at, I don't know what the clay pots are going to say about the UK, because I said the other day on social media, some UK newspaper did a hit piece on me and how I'm destroying the Civil Rights Division. I mean, the Magna Carta would like a word with the UK, because some of those concepts that we have in our Bill of Rights came from there, and yet people are arrested for their speech and their tweets in the UK, and it is a racially divided country with certain people, recent immigrants, running roughshod over those with suicidal empathy. And so hopefully America at this turning point has the wisdom to make the correct choices, because there won't be anybody in America looking at, maybe there'll be some Chinese people looking at what we did in America 250 years ago if we don't get it right.
If we don't get it right.
And literally, I felt like that last election cycle, I was actively involved in representing our president in that and helping others. It was a turning point. We could have lost it, but literally every election is an opportunity for us to completely lose it and permanently eliminate this way of life that so many people have, like my parents, brought me here for. And I think we owe it to future generations to maintain that. It really is the best in the world. And I've traveled to many dozens of countries. There is no country better than America, and we have to keep it that way.
I completely agree. We're not a perfect country, but what's amazing about this country is that it's continuing to do better. And probably in 250 years, they'll still have to do that. They'll still have to fight for their freedom and continue to do better.
No, freedom isn't free, and we're only one generation away from losing it at any given time.
Yeah. The amazing Harmeet Dhillon, thank you. Thank you for coming on to PragerU. We appreciate you so much. God bless you.
Thanks for having me, Marissa.